William Askew, height Bird, Philip Carper, James Dodd, Bernard Graves. These are men who would never see their families again, their mothers and fathers, their wives, their children. All of this caused by the Civil War. The Civil War was a horrible and bloody war. Many men fell on both the Union and the Confederacy's sides. The total death count came out to be more than 620,000 deaths. The Civil War had more casualties than any other war in American history. Its death count was higher than every war besides the Vietnam War, all put together. Many soldiers joined the military on the Union and Confederate sides, and many never came home. So many wives left widows, so many children left fatherless, so many parents left childless, so many soldiers left scarred with the sights of their dead comrades. The life of a soldier in the Civil War was torture, getting so many diseases, seeing so many of your friends disappear in a second, and to never see them again, to see so many families left without their fathers. April 12th, 1861, 4:30 a.m. The Confederates fired the first cannon upon Fort Sumter. Under the command of General Beauregard, the Confederates laid down heavy fire on the Union. The Union quickly prepared for battle. Captain Abner Doubleday made the first shot of the Union forces in defense of the fort. The firing continued all day. It was not very rapid due to the fact that they were trying to conserve ammunition. At one point in the battle, the flag was struck by a shell, and the stars and stripes fell to the ground. A brave soldier named Norman Hall exposed himself to enemy fire and put the stars and stripes back up into the air. Firing from the Confederates was not very accurate. An occasional shell would land on or in the fort. On Saturday, April 13, Anderson surrendered to the Confederates. Surprisingly, no one was killed on the Union side. The Confederates, though, did not have the same luck. They lost one of their horses. The terms of surrender allowed Anderson to perform a 100-gun salute before the fort would be evacuated the very next day. The next day, the salute started at 2 p.m., but was cut short to a 50-gun salute due to an accidental explosion, killing one of the gunners and mortally wounding another. The men carried their tattered banner to the ferries and rowed out to Union ships waiting outside of the harbor. When they arrived, they were treated as heroes for trying to keep the fort under Union control. General Albert Johnston was forced out of Kentucky and fell back to Corinth, Mississippi. Johnston was aware of the size of Grant's forces and that he had reinforcements on the way. He planned to attack the unfortified Union on April 6. The Confederates surprised the Union with a morning attack. By the afternoon, A few bands of men had fallen back onto an old sunken road. They had made a small fort called the Hornet's Nest. The Union tried to overpower the fort many times and failed. The Confederates surrounded the Union and forced them all back. The fighting went on all throughout the night. The Union held their ground, and the Confederates lost many men. Johnston was greatly wounded in the early parts of the battle. The Confederate forces were handed over to General Beauregard. Grant was reinforced with Buell's men. Beauregard was unaware of Buell's arrival. On April 7, William Nelson's division of Buell's army attacked the Confederates. Beauregard immediately ordered a counterattack. His counterattack was a success, but the Union stiffened up. This forced the Confederates to have to fall back and regroup. Beauregard ordered to make a second counterattack. This halted the Union's advance, and it ended in a stalemate. By this point in time, Beauregard had realized that he was greatly outnumbered, and that he had only way too many casualties already. Beauregard ordered a full retreat. The Confederates made their way back to Corinth. The Union had the Confederates beaten. The battle costed the Union and the Confederates greatly. The Union's casualties numbered over 13,000. The Confederates, more than 10,000 casualties. The Union may have forced the Confederates back, but it cost them many more men than the Confederates. September 16, 1862. George B. McClellan and the Army of the Potomac confronted Robert E. Lee's army at Sharpsburg, Maryland. On September 17th, General Hooker and his men led a great and powerful assault on General Lee's left flank. This was the beginning of the Battle of Antietam. This was the bloodiest day in all of American history. The Union forces made repetitive, powerful attacks, and the Confederates came back with powerful counterattacks. Although the Union had a great numerical advantage, all of Stonewall Jackson's men near the Dunker Church held their ground for that morning. Later on in the day, General Burnside moved across a stone bridge over Antietam Creek. The Confederates were not prepared and could barely hold their ground. At a crucial point in time, General Hills arrived from Harper's Ferry and made a counterattack. Although Lee was outnumbered 2-1, he still sent out his entire force. McClellan only let out 1/3 of his men. Since he did this, he gave Lee the chance to become a much greater threat. During the night, the Union and the Confederacy tended to their wounded and took account of their casualties. Although he had many casualties, Lee skirmished with McClellan while he moved his wounded south of Potomac. McClellan did not chase down the wounded Confederate army. The Union claimed victory, but it has been called as a draw. More than 22,000 soldiers died in the Battle of Antietam. This battle also had the most casualties in one night than any other battle ever in American history. Due to General Ambrose Burnside's failure at Fredericksburg and the Mud March, Lincoln decided that he needed to change out his generals. He put General Hooker in charge of the Army of the Potomac. Hooker got the army into top shape and made them stronger than they had ever been before. In late April, Hooker was able to outmaneuver Lee's army. The weather finally cleared up enough to make the roads hard enough for marching. On the final night of April, Hooker moved into Chancellorsville intersection. He was never able to escape the wilderness, though. The tangled brush spread for about 70 miles around Chancellorsville. On May 1st, Lee gathered together his army. He used his men to close Hooker in the wilderness, using two corridors in the region, the Orange Turnpike and the Orange Plank Road. On May 2nd, Jackson took 30,000 men to march around Hooker's men. This left Lee with around 15,000 men to fight the Union soldiers. Around 5 p.m., Jackson had completed his circuit. He attacked Hooker from the right flank and from behind. They forced the Union army back 2 miles. Jackson's men stormed out of the wilderness screaming the rebel yell as they crossed the high water mark of the Northern Virginia Army. Jackson fell, mortally wounded by the fire of his own men. By mid-morning, the Confederate cavalry broke through the Union's resistance. They took Chancellorsville and joined together in a cleared area. The battle was a Confederate win, but they had a great loss. Stonewall Jackson died of pneumonia. After a great victory at Chancellorsville, Lee led his army on a second invasion of the North. Lee planned to take supplies from the abundant Pennsylvania farmland. Hooker had his army in pursuit of Lee, but he was relieved of command 3 days before the battle. George Gordon took his place. On July 1st, Union cavalry slowed the Confederate advances. The next day, the Confederates wrapped around the Union. Lee launched an assault on the left flank of the Union. Although weakened by battle, the Union stayed strong and held their position through the day. On the morning of July 3rd, a huge infantry assault from the Confederates charged freight for the Union's center. This was Pickett's charge. It was quickly retreated after being stopped by musket and artillery fire. The victory was the Union's. Lee had intentions to protect Richmond with all the might he had. Grant wanted to occupy Richmond and take over the Confederate capital. On May 4th, 1864, Grant started moving his men across the Rapidan River and towards the camp of General Lee. Grant had wished to fight the south of the Wilderness, but that did not happen because some of his men ran into some of Lee's men and some fighting started in the wilderness on May 5th. Deep inside of the wilderness, both sides were practically invisible and had to move by compass or by gunfire. A lot of the brush caught on fire too, so it would suffocate the wounded or burn them. The battle raged on through the day, and men got lost. Eventually they started firing at their own, not realizing whose side they were on. By nightfall, the horrible battle was over. This didn't stop Grant, though. He kept moving through the Confederate lines on his way to take over Richmond. It had been a month since Lee's surrender to Grant. The war was ending quietly south of Texas. General Barrett took over the Union Army in Texas. He was given orders not to make any military actions, but he wanted his glory, and he ignored the orders. On May 12th, Barrett took 800 men to take down a Confederate outpost on the Rio Grande. The Union took it. The Confederates didn't fight back, so they didn't provoke a battle to take place. The Confederates, though, in the end, ended up making a counterattack and forced the Union soldiers back to a Confederate camp. The next morning, Barrett kept on trying to take over the camp, and the Confederates made counterattack after counterattack. They eventually were able to force them to withdraw. This time the Confederates pursued them and took prisoners. They did this until the horses got tired. By the time the battle had ended, the Confederates had captured 113 men. In the end, the Civil War, Lee ended up surrendering to Grant. The war cost both sides greatly, but in the end, only one nation suffered any losses. The South eventually rejoined the United States and reformed America. Slavery was also abolished throughout all of America now, but it came with a great price. It cost hundreds of thousands of men's lives. So many men that were willing to die to bring their country back together. So many who were willing to do what it takes to win the war. Many men did come home to their families at the end of the war, but there still were so many families that were left without their loved ones. Being a soldier back then isn't what it's like today. Being a soldier back then meant you didn't have much training, you were doing a lot of guerrilla warfare, and that you would be disease-stricken on many occasions. Nowadays, the life of a soldier is much easier. Throughout time as training becomes better, along with technology, the amount of deaths in a war go down greatly. In the past few wars, the casualties were about from the hundreds to only a few thousand. Things were much harder in the Civil War.